Greetings from the wonderful world of Wreckwatch, where we get up close and personal with the secrets of the deep. This is 7 Seas News, your one-stop porthole into the latest beneath the waves. Hey everyone, I'm at the British Museum. I haven't come here to see the Greek or Roman remains, but something even more interesting. Something that started out 6,500 kilometers away in West Africa in the Kingdom of Benin. So how did some art from the other side of the world end up in here? Today, the Benin Bronzes are elegantly displayed in the Africa Gallery of the British Museum. But how did they end up here? It was the 9th of February 1897. And over 1,000 British soldiers invaded the Kingdom of Benin in southern Nigeria. Britain justified the raid as the only way to get rid of unchristian slavery, cannibalism and voodoo. Benin was a city of blood and skulls. Or so London told the world. It was time to civilize the Edo people. To make sure of the victory, the soldiers attacked with rocket tubes and 2 million machine gun cartridges that could shoot over 300 bullets a second. It was a bloodbath. In just a few days, the Kingdom of Benin, ruled by a succession of obas or kings since 1440, was destroyed. The king was exiled, and 6 chiefs executed in the marketplace. The sacred landscape was razed to the ground, and then a golf course was built over it. Only none of it was true. Really, the raid was about greed and power. In 1897, the transatlantic slave trade may have been over, but England still wanted what West Africa had. Now it was about getting cheap rubber and palm oil to make Victorian soap, candles, lamp oil, and used for cooking. Ships heading to Britain were topped up with ivory, mahogany, ebony, chili pepper, coffee, cocoa, indigo, hides and nuts. You name it, West Africa was rich in it. To the victors the spoils. The British troops looted 10,000 bronzes, ivories and artworks from the palace walls and storerooms. Back in London, the 850 Benin Bronzes were sold in public auctions to pay for the raid and for the honour of bringing Christianity to West Africa. Today that art is scattered to the 4 corners of the world in 161 museums and galleries, from New York and London to Berlin, Moscow, Abu Dhabi and beyond. When the uncivilized art made by a degenerate people arrived in these museums though, something strange happened. The world could not get to grips with the brilliance in front of its eyes. How was a city of blood able to cast genius masterpieces that rivaled or even eclipsed anything the West could make? In the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin, a stunned Felix von Luschen wrote how these Benin works stand among the highest heights of European casting. Benvenuto Cellini could not have made a better cast himself, nor anyone before or after him, even to the present day. How the Benin Bronzes were actually made and how its metal ended up in West Africa was a mystery, and an enigma they stayed until now. Finally, in a lab in Bochum in Germany, Dr. Tobias Skowronek has cracked the mystery. Everything the world thought it knew about the Benin Bronzes is about to change. So delighted to be joined by Dr. Tobias Skowronek from the Technische Hochschule Georg Agricola in Bochum. Welcome to Wreckwatch TV, Tobias.
Thank you for having me.
And, congratulations on this really epic study that you've been doing, like 67 Manilas from shipwrecks, which you've chased around the world to America, Ghana, Spain, England, and all of these had these copper Manila bracelets on it. I mean, what is a Manila bracelet?
The name Manila derives from the Portuguese term for hand. They were always thought to resemble bracelets to be worn on the wrist or the ankles. But indeed, if we look at the chemical composition of them, they don't appear to be bracelets at all.
Right. And they have quite a sinister reputation, don't they? They're not for jewelry. They're not really for wearing. They're for something else, right?
Absolutely. They have been the currency of West Africa for many, many years. I think for around 500 years, they have been a currency. In Nigeria, they lasted until 1947, when the British authorities changed them against paper money.
The figures of which these things were traded are absolutely incredible. I mean, mountains of this stuff was going to West Africa, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The main problem about this is we don't have that much of ship lists or something like that we can calculate the total amounts of Manilas that were sent to West Africa. But if we only go with what we have at least, then we would be ending up with at least 300 millions of those Manilas in that time period. So that's insane.
It is insane. I can't even visualize what that looks like. I mean, it's 50,000 tons of brass. I mean, it just shows
Absolutely.
what the demand was for this stuff. And when you hold one of these things, I mean, if you hold 10 of them in your hand in the 16th, 17th century at times, you could buy one human being in West Africa with 10 of these objects. It just does strange things to the mind when you think about it. So, I mean, how do you go from lumps of shipwrecked metal to figuring out, where the metal that went into those came from? What's the process?
For that, we have to use the cutting edge technology that we have here at the lab of the Mining Museum. It's called ICP-MS. So it's an analytical instrument that can measure both the chemical composition down to 0.001%. So all different kinds of chemical elements. And we also have a multi-collector ICP-MS that can measure isotopes, lead isotopes. And those lead isotopes serve as a geochemical fingerprint that can be used to pinpoint the source of the metal used for these Manilas.
And is that right that most metals, most non-ferrous metals, have lead or even specks of it in it?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that is not made of iron has some percentages of lead or 0.01%, but that is enough because we can here in the lab isolate that lead and can measure only the lead.
So this is like the DNA analysis of the metal world, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So come on, tell us now, what did the results show? Where was the metal that went into these Manilas? Where did it come from?
It's interesting because I have compared the Manilas from the early wrecks with our database that we have here. So we have a database of 12,000 lead isotope ratios from all around the world. And they had the best matches with ore deposits that are located only 1 hour car drive away from where I'm right now in Bochum. So they are from the German Rhineland. So there have been industries that have produced those things in tons.
So hang on a second, the German Rhineland, I can't quite get my head around that. That's quite obscure. I mean, so what were the possibilities, at this time? England, Venice?
Yeah, Britain was a big producer of brass. Venice was a producer. At that time, there were also brass producing in Poland and in Scandinavia. But the Rhineland industries were very, very big at that time because they were located next to where the ore sources were. So that made producing brass at that location very efficient.
So how come nobody had figured this out before? Why hadn't they made the connection between this massive production in the Rhineland between Cologne and Aachen and selling this stuff to Europe?
Well, good thing no one did this before. So I have a chance to do research on that. There are a lot of textbooks that talk about the huge brass production in that area, but you will find no textbook that will link the production of brass in that area to the transatlantic slave trade because it's just not known. There are a handful of sources that talk about contracts between slave trading nations and brass producers of that particular area, but they are very scarce and hard to find and not very well known.
But if you look carefully in your research, you have found a few contracts, right?
Yeah, I found some contracts, for example, in the notary archives of Antwerp, so the Flemish town of Antwerp, where they did the contracts, and there we have them for no doubt. It's just.
And what do they say? Are they big exports? Are they small amounts? What are we talking about?
They're massive exports. So they are talking about hundreds of thousands Manilas being shipped to West Africa each year. There is this famous contract of the Fuggers, and they committed themselves to supply the Portuguese king with 1.4 million Manilas only in 3 years.
Wow.
So in order to match these numbers, they had to be able to produce 1,000 Manilas each day.
Oh my goodness. So in your model, then, we now know that Manilas were being produced in the Rhineland of Western Germany. They're then making their way to Antwerp in Belgium, where there's this massive commercial entrepot of merchants from around the world. And then they're going out into the North Sea and being traded and eventually ending up in West Africa. And, it's interesting that you talk about the Portuguese king, because these early shipwrecks, they're from a time when there was only one nation, right, that was really monopolizing what was going on in West Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Portugal was the biggest exporter of slaves to the New World.
So now we have the scientific picture from Europe. Thanks to your research, we can now prove that these Manilas made of brass in West Germany in enormous quantities are being bought by the Portuguese king and other merchants. They're going off to West Africa, but then they vanish. They're not being found in land excavations. They're not really being found in many shipwrecks out there. So, can science help us prove what actually happened to some of this metal?
Yeah, that is the curious question. What happened to the millions of Manilas being shipped to West Africa? And we've looked at our database here at the German Mining Museum again. So I already said it's a very, very big database, about 12,000 dead isotope ratios.
Wow.
And we compared it with the world famous Benin Bronzes. And if we compare the lead isotopes there, we get a definite hit.
What do your colleagues think about this when you've made the discovery?
We were not expecting that. We thought that West Africa received metal from a lot of different countries with their own ore resources, like Britain has very big resources in Cornwall, and in Scandinavia there are big occurrences. And we did not expect that the Benin bronzes were made solely from this German brass. This was totally unexpected.
But it makes sense artistically and historically, because your Manilas are mostly being made in the 16th century, a bit of the 17th century. The Benin bronzes date to the 16th century largely. And also, if you look very closely at some of these objects, they actually show Portuguese soldiers and Portuguese merchants, with Manila bracelets all around them. Like, we are the source of this raw material that you don't have and you need. And to us, it's a very valuable, cheap material. I mean, it's quite incredible, because, usually when you do these kind of studies, you have a inkling in your head about what the results are going to be. And then you do the studies and go, yeah, that's what I thought. But this just blows the whole subject of metal production in the transatlantic slave trade and the Benin bronzes, out the window. It is a real game changer. So, congratulations to you and your team on that. But of course, it leaves the Germans with some head scratching, because I imagine the Germans aren't particularly known, thankfully, for a role in the transatlantic slave trade. The Brandenburger forts, they were not very successful and they pulled out quite quickly. I mean, what do people think in Germany about, the role of the transatlantic slave trade and Manilas generally, from experts to the guy on the street?
I think most of people think it's not our business, that we have nothing to do with it. To be honest with you, it was my thought in the beginning too, because I have never figured out that I would have to do anything with this trade. The people on the street know that the Portuguese and the British and the French and the Dutch, they have something to do with the slave trade, and they played a dark role, and the governments that have said sorry for that openly. But I think with our study, we have shown how complex this whole trade is, and that that in rural areas like that Rhenish area is, there were industries that were participating in that and profiting from this trade in huge quantities.
So now that we know that these brass and metals are being mined in such massive amounts in Western Germany, is it just a kind of provincial impact? It made a few merchants incredibly wealthy and they got to have some nice dinners with the King of Portugal and swap gifts? Or is there any kind of a longer lasting impact?
The slave trade and the transatlantic economies was what kept this mining going.
Wow.
It was the start of the industrial revolution, if you want, because the profits that could be made, they were so big that the brass producers, they invested in this trade. would have been no industrial revolution if there was no slave trade.
So a project like this requires a lot of people, right?
To get the results, it's not just me in the lab, but also involved a lot of interdisciplinary scientists, like the underwater archaeologist who brought the Manilas up from the shipwrecks, and the field archaeologist, and so on. And I visited them in the US and in England and in Spain, so all around the Atlantic world. And this study would not have been possible if I would not had them.
And that's why the Benin Bronzes are such immensely important works of art. They aren't just about craftsmanship and colonization. They are symbols of mighty waves of trade, the horrors of slavery, and how the modern world was made for good and bad. Most people come to cultural institutions like the British Museum to see the monumental, the Rosetta Stone used to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Elgin marbles that epitomise the beauty of 5th century BC Greece, or even the mystery of the crystal skull. The Benin Bronzes, though, setting aside the question of whether they should be in London at all, are at the very top of the star attractions of the British Museum. Well, that's it for today. If you found this video interesting, or more likely informative, don't forget to subscribe or like it. And until next time, deep down we care.